The first thing people noticed wasn't the sound of glass breaking. It was the silence that came right after. A man stood in the middle of a small bakery, chest rising, hands trembling, surrounded by the wreckage he had just caused. Flour dust hung in the air like smoke, settling slowly over shattered display cases and crushed pastries. He hadn't come there to destroy anything. He came for answers. But anger has a way of turning questions into damage, and in less than a minute, everything the woman behind that counter had built was lying in pieces at his feet. What he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know in that moment, was that the same woman he had just ruined had already done something that would change his life forever. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. His name was Daniel Carter, a 41-year-old real estate developer known for getting what he wanted when he wanted it. In cities across the country, his name carried weight. Old buildings disappeared, new glass towers replaced them, and entire neighborhoods shifted under his decisions. People called him efficient, focused, relentless. They rarely called him kind, and Daniel had never cared enough to correct them. The bakery he stood in now was the last obstacle in a project he had spent 3 years assembling. Every other property on the block had been purchased, negotiated, or legally acquired. Every contract had been signed. Every owner had agreed to move on. Except one, the small corner bakery owned by a woman named Claire Bennett. Claire Bennett had run that bakery for nearly 2 decades. It wasn't the biggest shop in the city, and it wasn't trying to be. It was the kind of place where regulars didn't need to order because she already knew what they wanted. The kind of place where mornings started early, ovens warmed the air before sunrise, and the smell of fresh bread carried out onto the street. To Daniel, it was a problem. To Claire, it was her entire life. When his team first approached her with an offer, she declined politely. When they returned with a higher number, she still refused. When the offers became more aggressive, the answer never changed. She wasn't selling. Daniel didn't understand that kind of resistance. In his world, everything had a price, and if the number was right, people moved. That belief had worked for him every single time, until now. So he did what he always did when something didn't go his way. He showed up in person. That morning, he walked into Claire's bakery not as a customer, but as a man expecting compliance. The conversation started calmly enough. He explained the project again, outlined the benefits, emphasized the opportunity. Claire listened the way she always did, quietly, patiently, hands resting on the counter as if she had nowhere else to be. When she finally spoke, her answer was the same as before. She wasn't interested. Daniel pressed harder. The tone shifted. What began as negotiation turned into frustration, and frustration turned into anger. He questioned her reasoning, challenged her decision, raised his voice just enough to make the room feel smaller. Claire didn't match his energy. She didn't argue. She didn't shout. She simply stood there, steady, looking at him in a way that made him feel like he was the one out of place. And for a man who built his life on control, that feeling was unfamiliar. It happened quickly after that. A glass jar near the edge of the counter was knocked aside. Whether by accident or intention, even Daniel couldn't fully explain later. It hit the floor and shattered, and something in him snapped along with it. The first crash led to another. A tray of pastries swept off the display. A metal rack pushed over. Flour scattered, mixing with broken glass and frosting, turning the polished bakery floor into a mess of color and chaos. Customers stepped back, some leaving immediately, others frozen in place, unsure of what they were witnessing. And through all of it, Claire didn't move. When the noise finally stopped, the reality of what he had done settled in. The room looked different now. Not just damaged, but violated. Daniel stood there, breathing hard, surrounded by silence that felt heavier than the destruction itself. He expected anger from her. He expected shouting, accusations, something to match what he had just unleashed. Instead, Claire walked around the counter slowly, stepping carefully over the broken glass, and began picking up pieces of what remained. She didn't look at him right away. She didn't say anything for several seconds. And when she finally did, her voice was calm in a way that made it impossible to ignore. She told him to leave. There was no threat in her words, no raised tone, just a quiet certainty. Daniel hesitated for a moment, as if waiting for something more, but nothing came. No argument followed. No dramatic confrontation. Just that single request, steady and final. And for reasons he didn't fully understand, He listened. He turned, walked out of the bakery, and stepped back onto the street where everything felt normal again, as if nothing had happened inside. But something had shifted. Not in the city, not in his project, but in him. Over the next few days, Daniel moved forward the way he always did. Meetings continued. Plans advanced. The project didn't stop because of one incident, and from a business perspective, nothing had changed. Legal teams reviewed options. Pressure strategies were discussed. There were ways to force a sale, ways to make holding on to that bakery difficult enough that Claire would eventually give in. It was all routine, predictable, the kind of process Daniel had overseen countless times before. And yet, something about this situation refused to settle into that familiar pattern. It started with small things. A distraction during meetings. A moment of hesitation before signing off on the next step. A thought that returned at inconvenient times, usually when things were quiet. He kept seeing the way Claire had looked at him, not with fear, not with anger, but with something else entirely. It wasn't approval. It wasn't forgiveness. It was something steadier than both. And it stayed with him longer than he expected. 3 nights after the incident, Daniel received a call that shifted everything. His mother had been admitted to the hospital earlier that evening after collapsing at home. The details were unclear at first, but serious enough that he didn't hesitate. He canceled everything, drove across the city, and arrived to find a situation far more fragile than he was prepared for. She had suffered a severe allergic reaction, one that escalated quickly and required immediate intervention. According to the doctors, timing had made the difference. Minutes mattered, and in her case, someone had acted fast enough to keep things from becoming irreversible. Daniel listened carefully, asking questions, trying to understand exactly what had happened. His mother lived alone, and there were no family members nearby who could have responded that quickly. When he asked who had called emergency services, the answer caught him off guard. It wasn't a neighbor. It wasn't a passerby. It was a woman who had been in the apartment earlier that day, someone who had brought over a delivery and noticed the signs before things went too far. Her name, the doctor said, was Claire Bennett. For a moment, Daniel thought he had misheard. The name didn't fit the situation in his mind. It didn't connect with the image he had of the woman standing in that destroyed bakery, calmly telling him to leave. But the details were clear. Claire had started offering small neighborhood deliveries months earlier, part of an effort to keep her business steady. Daniel's mother had become one of her regular customers. They spoke often. They knew each other's routines. And on that particular afternoon, Claire had arrived just in time to recognize that something was wrong. She hadn't hesitated. She called for help, stayed until paramedics arrived, and made sure Daniel's mother was stable before leaving quietly, without waiting for recognition or gratitude. By the time Daniel reached the hospital, she was already gone. She hadn't mentioned it to anyone else. She hadn't tried to contact him. And she had certainly not connected the man who destroyed her bakery to the woman she had just helped save. The weight of that realization settled in slowly, but when it did, it was impossible to ignore. The timeline was clear. The same day he stood in her shop, tearing through everything she had built, was the same day she had stepped into his mother's apartment and made a decision that kept her alive. The contrast between those two moments didn't leave room for easy explanations. It didn't fit into the categories Daniel was used to. There was no transaction, no negotiation, no exchange. Just 2 actions, completely separate, tied together by a connection he hadn't even known existed. The next morning, Daniel did something he rarely did without a clear plan. He returned to the bakery. The damage from a few days earlier was still visible, though some effort had been made to clean and restore what could be saved. The front door opened with a quiet sound, and for a moment, everything inside felt still. Claire was behind the counter again, working the way she always had, as if routine itself was a form of stability. When she looked up and saw him, there was no visible surprise, no shift in posture, just a brief pause before she returned her attention to what she was doing. Daniel stepped forward, but this time, there was no urgency in his movement. No expectation. The words he had prepared on the drive over didn't come out the way he intended. What he wanted to say was complicated, tied up in apology, confusion, and something unfamiliar that sat somewhere between regret and respect. He began with the simplest part. He told her about his mother. He told her what the doctors had said. And then he said something he hadn't said in a very long time. "Thank you." Claire listened without interrupting. the same way she had during every previous conversation. When he finished, she nodded slightly, as if acknowledging a fact rather than accepting praise. She explained that she had only done what anyone should do in that situation. There was no emphasis on what it meant, no attempt to make it larger than it was. To her, it was simple. Someone needed help, and she was there. Daniel stood there longer than he expected, the noise of the city outside barely registering. For the first time since he started the project, the bakery didn't look like an obstacle. It looked like something else entirely. Something that didn't belong in the plans he had drawn up, the timelines he had followed, or the systems he trusted. And for the first time in years, Daniel Carter found himself reconsidering a decision he had once believed was already made. Daniel Carter had spent most of his life believing that problems could be solved with pressure, persistence, or money. But standing inside that bakery again, he understood that none of those applied here. Claire Bennett didn't react the way people usually did around him. She didn't soften when he thanked her, didn't show anger over what he had done, and didn't take the opportunity to remind him of it either. That absence of reaction unsettled him more than any confrontation could have. It left him with nothing to push against, no resistance he could break down, no emotion he could redirect. For the first time in years, Daniel found himself in a situation where control wasn't something he could take. It was something he had already lost. He looked around the shop again, noticing details he had ignored before, the worn edges of the wooden counter, the handwritten menu, the small photographs pinned near the register, and he realized this place wasn't just a business. It was history, routine, and identity built over time in ways his projects never were. He asked her how much the damage would cost, but the question sounded hollow even to him. Claire gave a simple estimate. Nothing exaggerated, nothing softened, just the truth. He nodded, already knowing he would cover it, but the money felt like the least important part of what stood between them. There was a pause after that, longer than usual, and instead of filling it with another offer or argument, Daniel did something unfamiliar. He asked a question that had nothing to do with contracts or negotiations. He asked why the bakery mattered so much to her. Claire hesitated for a moment, not because she didn't have an answer, but because she was deciding whether it was worth giving. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a quiet weight that made him listen differently than before. She told him the bakery had belonged to her parents before it was hers, that she had grown up in that same space, learning recipes before she was old enough to reach the counter without a stool. She explained how it survived years when business was slow, how regular customers became friends, and how some of them had been coming in long enough to watch her grow from a child into the person standing in front of him. It wasn't just a shop that sold bread and pastries. It was a place where people marked time, where small routines held meaning, where memories were tied to something as simple as a morning visit. Selling it wasn't just about leaving a building behind. It meant letting go of something that couldn't be rebuilt somewhere else, no matter how much money was offered. Daniel listened without interrupting, and as she spoke, something shifted in the way he saw the situation. For years, he had viewed properties as assets, locations as opportunities, and resistance as temporary obstacles. But Claire wasn't resisting because she wanted more money or better terms. She was refusing because what she had couldn't be replaced, and that was something his usual methods had never accounted for. When she finished, the silence between them returned, but it felt different this time, less tense, more final. Daniel understood then that no offer he made would change her mind, not because she was being difficult, but because she was being honest. He left the bakery that day without making another proposal, and for the first time since the project began, he allowed himself to consider a possibility he had ignored from the start. Walking away. It wasn't a simple decision. The development was already in motion, investors were involved, timelines had been set, and backing out would come with consequences he had spent years avoiding. But the more he thought about it, the clearer it became that continuing as planned would require him to become the same version of himself that had stood in that bakery days earlier, the version that saw destruction as a form of progress. And after everything that had happened, that version no longer felt as certain as it once did. Over the next week, Daniel reviewed the project from a different perspective. He sat through meetings with his team, listened to proposals, and asked questions he hadn't considered before. What would it cost to redesign the development around the bakery instead of removing it? What would it take to preserve that single corner while still moving forward with the rest of the plan? At first, The responses were immediate and predictable. It would complicate the layout, reduce efficiency, affect profitability. The bakery didn't fit into the vision they had created. It disrupted the uniformity of the project. It wasn't practical, but Daniel didn't dismiss the idea the way he normally would. He kept asking, kept pushing, not with anger this time, but with a kind of focus that made his team realize this wasn't a passing thought. Days turned into discussions, discussions turned into revisions, and slowly, a different version of the project began to take shape. It wasn't the original plan, and it wasn't as clean or straightforward, but it worked. The bakery could remain, integrated into the design rather than erased from it. It would stand between the new buildings, unchanged in structure but surrounded by something modern, something that would bring more people into the area instead of pushing them out. From a business standpoint, it wasn't the most efficient choice, but it wasn't a failure either. It was simply different, and for Daniel, that difference mattered more than he expected. When he returned to the bakery again, the conversation wasn't about buying it anymore. Claire noticed the shift immediately, not because of what he said, but because of what he didn't say. There were no offers, no pressure, no attempt to convince her of anything. Instead, Daniel explained the revised plan, carefully, clearly, without expectation. He told her the bakery would remain exactly where it was, and that the surrounding development would move forward without requiring her to give anything up. For a moment, Claire didn't respond. She studied him the same way she had from the beginning, as if measuring whether this was another strategy or something genuine. When she finally spoke, she asked him why he had changed his approach. It wasn't a challenge, just a question, simple and direct. Daniel considered his answer carefully, knowing that anything less than the truth would be obvious. He told her that for years, he had built things by removing whatever stood in the way, believing that progress required it. But recently, he had started to question whether that approach left too much behind. He didn't mention guilt directly, didn't try to frame it as redemption, but the meaning was clear in the way he said it. This wasn't about fixing a mistake. It was about not repeating it. Claire didn't respond right away, and Daniel didn't expect her to. Trust wasn't something that returned quickly, especially after what had happened. But she nodded slightly, a small acknowledgement that didn't erase the past, but allowed for something new to exist beside it. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was something closer to understanding. And in that moment, that was enough. The project moved forward over the following months, not in the way Daniel had originally planned, but in a way that felt more complete. Construction began around the bakery, careful not to disrupt it, and as the structure of the new development rose, the small corner shop remained exactly as it had always been. Customers continued to walk through its doors, unaware of how close it had come to disappearing, unaware of the decisions that had changed its future. For Claire, the routine stayed the same, but the world around her shifted, bringing new faces, new opportunities, and a different kind of attention to something she had built long before any of it existed. For Daniel, the change wasn't as visible, but it was there. He approached his work differently, not abandoning what had made him successful, but adjusting it in ways that allowed for something more than efficiency. The project that once felt like another addition to his portfolio became something else entirely, a reminder that not everything valuable could be measured the way he was used to. And every time he passed that bakery, still standing where it had always been, he was reminded of a moment that had forced him to see things differently, not through loss or failure, but through an unexpected connection that changed the direction of everything that followed. Before we close this story, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And do not forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos.